Okay, so for today's video, we're going to be talking about an indirect but maximal exercise test. Sometimes people will say that a gas exchange like analysis is an indirect test because you're not directly measuring the actual exchange of oxygen and CO2 at the cellular level or the production of lactic acid like in the muscle. So that is quote unquote an indirect measure of ventilatory threshold. But in terms of what typically people say, this is what's considered an indirect test because you're using plotted data points from a workload and then normative data to assume someone's VO2 or VO2 based on other people's measurements of VO2 and what that likely should be based on their heart rate and workload. So this is what's typically called an indirect. So I will pop off to the side here and we will get going. Okay, so what you need before you start is not much. It's not anywhere near the amount of stuff you need to run a direct test. You basically need an erg of some kind, a treadmill, a cycle ergometer, or you could probably do this on a rowing or skiing erg or something like that. You typically would need an RPE or clipboard or something, something just to hold your things on. I would generally prefer to use a heart rate monitor as a backup. You can definitely do palpated heart rate, and you'll see that we're going to do that in this video. Because this is staged, you don't need data points at every single time point, but a heart rate monitor, they're so cheap nowadays, it really is super nice to just have as a backup and have that continuous data. And then you can just write it down at the end of each stage, and you're not trying to double or multitask, doing a whole bunch of things and potentially missing something, especially if you're just starting out running these tests. So like I said, you're going to need an erg of some kind. Choosing a treadmill versus a bike, obviously that's going to vary your protocol and how you design it. You also want to make sure that it's generally specific to the goals that that person wants to achieve, or typically their training history. If a person is a runner and they only have running goals, to test them on a cycle erg would probably fry their legs, and you'd actually really undershoot what their potential VO2 is, especially because you're not exactly measuring, and that normative data is probably comparing back to cyclists. So you just really want to make sure that because you're not actually using their measured gas exchange, you choose the right test. It's just all that more important. You want to make sure that you have an RPE chart, like I said, on a clipboard or something, probably even a stopwatch in this case, because before, when we're doing a direct test, the computer calculates the time and the start and end of the test are all automatically cataloged. Now you'll probably want to have a stopwatch with you as well to make sure that you're hitting the stages at the correct times. A blood pressure cuff is always optional here, but it's just a nice to have, and especially if you have two people, it's nice to get that extra measurement in. Okay, so you're going to need your data input chart and your exercise protocol ready. So here I've designed an exercise protocol where the person is on a bike, so they're warming up for 2 minutes at 70 RPMs. They then increase the wattage at roughly a rate of oh, that's 2 minutes there. So anyways, roughly at a rate of 15 watts a minute. So fairly slowly. This is for somebody who doesn't cycle all that much. But again, in that 10 to 12 minute range, getting up to 240 watts would probably be a pretty heavy load on someone who doesn't cycle all that much. You're going to need the participants' PARQ Plus and their general health questionnaire beforehand to make sure they have no contraindications to running this test, their height, weight, and age, because sometimes you need that normative data to put back into the charts at the end or any of the calculations. Okay, so without further ado here, I'm going to play this video and I'll pop off the screen. This will probably pause when I do that. Yep. Okay. So this should look fairly familiar actually if you're watching this from exercise physiology, because I want to show it again and the test is exactly the same. I just want you looking for different things. Before, when we were talking about cardiac output, specifically looking at the stroke volume and heart rate measures that the PhysioFlow our participant is wearing is measuring, but everything else is exactly the same that you would run in an indirect test. So now I just want you watching the same test again, especially if you've watched the direct test video. Now again, focusing on everything we did and how this would not change at all. I wouldn't change the protocol. I wouldn't change anything we did other than the fact that we set him up with some electrodes for that cardiac output measurement beforehand. I really don't monitor that at all during the test. I'm not looking at those numbers at all. It's not anything you can change. So just making sure measures are good to start, having the participant start his warm-up. You can see there's some communication between the two experimenters. Myself and Nick sync our stopwatches. And he's got blood pressure cuffs on, so I'll be taking blood pressure. Nick will be recording RPE and heart rate at each interval. You can see he's also got a heart rate monitor on, so Nick will be checking either the watch or palpating and just double checking and referencing both those numbers against each other to make sure that he's getting the consistent numbers. So obviously during the warm-up phase, there's not going to be all that much going on. I'll actually turn up the background audio so you can sort of hear what's going on a little bit as this test goes on. So you can see there we're checking that cardiac output data. I'm checking my watch to make sure it's synced. But really during an indirect test, there's not all that much going on during the middle of the stages. Towards the end, you'll have to encourage a participant to keep going. On a cycle test, where you have a set wattage, and let's say you've designated a set amount of KPs, you have to make sure that they're maintaining their given RPMs. On a treadmill test, I mean, if you're doing an indirect treadmill test, as long as they're on the treadmill, they're maintaining. On a bike like this, where it's automatically braked or electronically braked bike, he can pedal at any RPMs, and it'll automatically adjust the wattage to ensure that he's got the appropriate load. So really, as long as his feet are moving, I know that he's pedaling at the watts that I've set it at, similar to a treadmill. So you can see that at the end of that 2 minutes, Nick and I both move in. He palpates heart rate and I take blood pressure. And really, indirect tests are just time management, making sure that you're monitoring how your participant looks, how comfortable they're feeling, and then get all these measures in 10 seconds at the end of each stage. That's really all, I can't stress enough. It is managing those 10 seconds at the end of each stage, not bleeding into the next workload, not frying 30 seconds off your next workload or extending your current workload 30 seconds too long because you couldn't get a blood pressure in. And it doesn't look like much when you see somebody do it who's fairly practiced, but really not having to take double or triple measurements and getting accurate measurements is really the, how should I say this, the part of an indirect test that sort of goes unnoticed or doesn't really get practiced until you do it once and you see, oh yeah, I messed up that 10 seconds and that ruined the whole test. And I just sat there for a minute 50 before it. But really there's nothing you can do in that minute 50 other than talk to your participant, make sure they're doing all right, talk to your co-experimenter, and really make sure that, okay, yep, coming up, one of us is watching, okay, 20 seconds out, okay, getting ready for your measurements. Okay, there, you see our nod, good communication. We take our measurements to try and not make the participant as uncomfortable as possible. You can see that even though he's got both arms out here, it's a fairly light workload. As he gets towards the harder workloads, it's definitely going to get more cumbersome for us to be grabbing both arms and him to not sort of be grounded and really sort of forcing his legs down. Really sort of waddling in the saddle towards the end. But yeah, we take 15 seconds or whatever that is, get our measurements as accurately as possible, ask RPE, Nick asks RPE while I'm increasing the workload, and then that's it. And then your participant's good for about another minute 30 in that workload. There are indirect tests, and I think people typically use these more in direct tests because you want stages in an indirect test to plot those data points. You are taking the person to a workload that you will have an end data point and an end heart rate. You're not doing this like predictive analysis that a submax test is doing, but you typically want standardized workloads so they hit steady state, so you have that solid data point to plot. They're not steadily increasing their heart rate, but there are tests that especially on an electronically braked bike, you can do, and I've done one where you increase, let's say, 2 watts 1 watt every 2 seconds. So 30 watts a minute, but it's a very gradual hill climb, like the exact same slope, and it's just gradually getting harder and harder. There is no incremental increase in the workload. That can really fry some people's legs, especially on a bike. They take 2 steps up, and like we see here, participants starting to work pretty hard. And this is where it really takes taking good measurements, especially with blood pressure and manually palpated heart rate. Participants are really moving all over the place, and you don't want to take extra long because you're only prolonging the test and then not having as much data in the next workload. Okay, he's back on the bike. He'll finish that up. We'll get our PE and then increase the workload to the next one. The time does go by very fast in between. Like I said, you're kind of hurry up and wait, but you're managing everything else that's going on, and it's really easy to miss that time and look down and, oh no, you're right at the end of where you're supposed to change the stage and you haven't taken your measurements. So it's really just practice, and you can see here the participant was too fatigued to really keep it up, so we had volitional failure there, and run it back down into a cool down phase. And that's really all the indirect test is. And there are a bunch of other things that get done during an indirect test. Obviously, using workload and heart rate and normative data, you can predict their VO2 or sort of extrapolate what it would be based on other people's measured VO2s and that workload data. But the indirect test is sort of a blanket test across multiple different avenues, such as cardiac rehab, where we're doing a cardiac output measurements here. You could also do ECG measurements during it, and then you could also take direct test measurements during it as well. So really, that's it. That's pretty much the end of the test. We have our participant cooling down, and I'll stop the video there. That's if I pop back up here, boom. That's really going to be it, and that's what your results are. You don't have any actual breath by breath or second by second data. You just have the data you recorded at the end of each stage. You have your RPE, your blood pressure if you recorded that, and then your heart rate. So then you can take that workload and heart rate, either put it into a predictive equation if you used a previously published test with an equation that goes along with it, or you could plot it into Excel and then extrapolate and find that final data point and then map that out to VO2 based on normative data. So yeah, that's pretty much exactly how that goes. I guess I'll make that a little bit bigger for 1 second, but that is how to run an indirect test. Not much to it, and especially if you watch the direct test, you can see that there's way more going on. So practicing the indirect test and getting that down pat is really, really handy, especially when you start doing everything else. You can see that during the direct test, there's actually not that much more going on than during the indirect. You're just kind of watching the data a little bit more. There's a lot more setup beforehand, and again, making sure your data is good during a direct basically turns it into an indirect with a couple glances over at the computer screen, and then you have more accurate data after. But that's really it. It's the same process throughout, and I can't stress that enough, that just understanding that and getting some practice in when you get the chance is and making sure that you're good at the indirect test and just sort of get comfortable with it will really make you a great experimenter. Thanks for watching.